Wyrd Sisters by Terry Pratchett. All credit, of course, goes to Penguin Random House and Sir Terry Pratchett, may he rest in peace. Page 1. The wind howled. Lightning stabbed at the earth erratically, like an inefficient assassin. Thunder rolled back and forth across the dark rain-lashed hills. The night was as black as the inside of a cat. It was the kind of night, you could believe, on which gods moved men as though they were pawns on the chessboard of fate. In the middle of this elemental storm of fire gleamed among the dripping furze bushes like the madness in a weasel's eye. It illuminated 3 hunched figures. As the cauldron bubbled, an eldritch voice shrieked, "When shall we 3 meet again?" There was a pause. Finally, another voice said, in a far more ordinary tones, "Well, I can do next Tuesday." Through the fathomless deeps of space swims the star turtle Great Artuin, bearing on its back the 4 giant elephants who carry on their shoulders the mass of the disk world. A tiny sun and moon spin around them on a complicated orbit to induce seasons, so probably nowhere else in the multiverse is it sometimes necessary for an elephant to cock a leg to allow the sun to go past. Exactly why this should be may never be known. Possibly the creator of the universe got bored with all the usual business of axial inclination, albedos, and rotational velocities and decided to have a bit of fun for once. It would be a pretty good bet that the gods of a world like this probably do not play chess, and indeed this is the case. In fact, no gods anywhere play chess. They haven't got the imagination. Gods prefer simple, vicious games, where you do not achieve transcendence but go straight to oblivion. A key to understanding of all religion is that a god's idea of amusement is snakes and ladders with greased rungs. Magic glues the disk world together. Magic generated by the turning of the world itself. Magic wound like silk out of the underlying structure of existence to suture the wounds of reality. A lot of it ends up in the Ramtop Mountains, which stretch from the frozen lands near the hub all the way via a lanky archipelago to the warm seas which flow endlessly into space over the rim. Raw magic crackles invisibly from peak to peak, and Earth itself in the mountains. It is the Ramtops that supply the world with most of its witches and wizards. In the Ramtops, the leaves on the trees move even when there is no breeze. Rocks go for a stroll for an evening. Even the land, at times, seems alive. At times, so does the sky. The storm was really giving it everything it had. This was its big chance. It had spent years hanging around the provinces, putting in some useful work as a squall, building up experience, making contacts, occasionally leaping out on an unsuspecting shepherd, or blasting quite small oak trees. Now an opening in the weather had given it an opportunity to strut its hour, and it was building up its role in the hope of being spotted by one of the big climates. It was a good storm. There was quite effective projection and passion there, and critics agreed that if it would only learn to control its thunder, it would be, in years to come, a storm to watch. The woods roared their applause, and they were full of mists and flying leaves. On nights such as these, the gods, as has already been pointed out, play games other than chess with the fates of mortals and the thrones of kings. It is important to remember that they always cheat right up to the end. And a coach came hurtling along the rough forest track, jerking violently as the wheels bounced off tree roots. The driver lashed at the team, the desperate crack of his whip providing a rather neat counterpoint to the crash of the Tempest overhead. Behind, only a little way behind, and getting closer, were 3 hooded riders. On nights such as this, evil deeds are done, and good deeds, of course, but mostly evil, on the whole. On nights such as this, witches are abroad. Well, not actually abroad, they don't like the food, and you can't trust the water, and the shamans always hog the deck chairs. But there was a full moon breasting the ragged clouds, and the rushing air was full of whispers and a very broad hint of magic. In their clearing above the forest, the witches spoke thus. "I'm babysitting on Tuesday," said the one with no hat, but a thatch of white curls so thick she might have been wearing a helmet. For Jason's youngest, I can manage Friday. Hurry up with the tea, love, I'm that parched." The junior member of the trio gave a sigh, and ladled some boiling water out of the cauldron into the teapot. The third witch patted her hand in a kindly fashion. "You said it quite well," she said. "Just a bit more work on the screeching. Ain't that right, Nanny Og?" "Very useful screeching, I thought," said Nanny Og hurriedly. "And I can see Goody Wemper, may she rest in peace, gave you a lot of help with the squint." "It's a good squint," said Granny Weatherwax. The junior witch, whose name was Margaret Garlick, relaxed considerably. She held Granny Weatherwax in awe. It was known throughout the Ramtop Mountains that Miss Weatherwax did not approve of anything very much. If she said it was a good squint, then Margaret's eyes were probably staring up her own nostrils. Unlike wizards, who like nothing better than a complicated hierarchy, we just don't go in much for this structured approach to career progression. It's up to each individual witch to take on a girl to hand the area over to when she dies. Witches are not by nature gregarious, at least with other witches, and they certainly don't have leaders. Granny Weatherwax was the most highly regarded of the leaders they didn't have. Margaret's hand shook slightly as they made the tea. Of course, it was all very gratifying, but it was nerve-wracking to start one's life as a village witch between Granny and, on the other side of the forest, Nanny Og. It had been her idea to form a local coven. She felt it was more, a cult. To her amazement, the other two had agreed, or at least hadn't disagreed that much. "An oven?" Nanny had said. "What do we want to join an oven for?" "She means a coven, Githa," Granny Weatherwax had explained. "You know, like in the old days, a meeting." "And ease up," said Nanny Og hopefully. "No dancing," Granny had warned. "I don't hold with dancing, or singing, or getting overexcited, all that messing about with ointments and similar. Does you good to get out," said Nanny happily. Margaret had been disappointed about the dancing, and was relieved that she hadn't ventured one or two other ideas that had been on her mind. She fumbled in the packet she had brought with her. It was her first Sabbath, and she was determined to do it right. "Would anyone care for a scone?" she said. Granny looked hard at hers before she bit. Margaret had baked bat designs on it. They had little eyes made of currants. The coach crashed through the trees at the forest edge, ran on two wheels for a few seconds as it hit a stone, righted itself against all the laws of balance, and rumbled on. But it was going slower now. The slope was dragging at it. The coachman, standing upright in the manner of a charioteer, pushed his hair out of his eyes and peered through the murk. No one lived up here, in the lap of the Ramtops themselves, but there was a light ahead. By all that was merciful, there was a light ahead. An arrow buried itself in the coach roof behind him. Meanwhile, King Verence, monarch of Lancre, was making a discovery. Like most people at any rate below the age of 60 or so, Verence hadn't exercised his mind much about what happened to you when you died. Like most people since the dawn of time, he assumed it all somehow worked out all right in the end. And like most people since the dawn of time, he was now dead. He was, in fact, lying at the bottom of one of his own stairways in Lancre Castle, with a dagger in his back. He sat up and was surprised to find that while someone he was certainly inclined to think of as himself was sitting up, something very much like his body remained lying on the floor. It was a pretty good body, incidentally, now that he came to see it from outside for the first time. He'd always been quite attached to it, though. He had to admit this did not seem to be the case. It was big and well-muscled. He'd looked after it. He'd allowed it a moustache and long flowing locks. He'd seen it got plenty of healthy outdoor exercise and lots of red meat. Now, just when a body would have been useful, it had let him down, or out. On top of that, he had to come to terms with a tall, thin figure standing beside him. Most of it was hidden in a hooded black robe, but the one arm which extended from the folds to grip a large scythe was made of bone. When one is dead, there are things one intrinsically recognizes. Hello. Verence drew himself up to his full height, or what would have been his full height if that part of him to which the word height could have been applied was not lying stiff on the floor and facing a future in which only the word depth could be appropriate. "I am a king, mark you," he said. "Was, your majesty." "What?" Verence barked. "I said was. It's called the past tense. You'll soon get used to it." The tall figure tapped its calcareous fingers on the scythe's handle. It was obviously upset about something. If it came to that, Verence thought, so am I. But the various broad hints available in his present circumstances were breaking through even the mad brain stupidity that had made up most of his character. And it was dawning on him that whatever kingdom he might currently be in, he wasn't the king of it. "Are you Death, fellow?" he ventured. "I have many names." "Which one are you using at present?" said Verence with a shade of more deference. There were people milling around them. In fact, quite a few people were milling through them, like ghosts. "Oh, so it was Felmet," the king added vaguely, looking at the figure lurking with obscene delight at the top of the stairs. "My father said I should never let him get behind me. Why don't I feel angry?" "Glands," said Death shortly. "Adrenaline and so forth, and emotions. You don't have them. All you have now is thought." The tall figure appeared to reach a decision. "This is very irregular," he went on, apparently to himself. "However, who am I to argue?" "Who indeed?" "What?" "I said who indeed." "Shut up." Death stood with his skull on one side, as though listening to some inner voice. As his hood fell away, the late king noticed that Death resembled a polished skeleton in every way but one. His eye sockets glowed sky blue. Verence wasn't frightened, however, not simply because it was difficult to be in fear of anything when the bits you need to be frightened with are curdling 7 yards away, but because he had never really been frightened of anything in his life, and wasn't going to start now. This was partly because he didn't have the imagination, but he was also one of those rare individuals who are totally focused in time. Most people aren't. They live their lives as a sort of temporal blur around the point where their body actually is, anticipating the future or holding on to the past. They're usually so busy thinking about what happens next that the only time they ever find out what is happening now is when they come to look back on it. Most people are like this. They learn how to fear because they can actually tell, down at the subconscious level, what is going to happen next. It's already happening to them. But Verence had always lived only for the present. Well, until now, anyway. Death sighed. "I suppose no one mentioned anything to you?" he hazarded. Say again?" "No premonitions, strange dreams, mad old soothsayers shouting things at you in the street?" "About what? Dying?" "No, I suppose not. It would be too much to expect," said Death sourly. "They leave it all to me." "Who do?" said Verence, mystified. "Fate, destiny, all the rest of them." Death laid a hand on the king's shoulder. "The fact is, I'm afraid you're due to become a ghost." "Oh?" He looked down at his body, which seemed solid enough. Then someone walked through him. "Don't let it upset you." Verence watched his own stiff corpse being carried reverentially from the hall. "I'll try," he said. "Good man." "I don't think I'll be up to all that business with the white sheets and the chains, though," he said. "Do I have to walk around moaning and screaming?" Death shrugged. "Do you want to?" he said. No. "Then I shouldn't bother, if I were you." Death pulled an hourglass from the recesses of his dark robe and inspected it closely. "And now I really must be going," he said. He turned on his heel, put his scythe over his shoulder, and started to just walk out of the hall through the wall. "I say, just hold on there," shouted Verence, running after him. Death didn't look back. Verence followed him through the wall. It was like walking through fog. "Is that all?" he demanded. "I mean, how long will I be a ghost? Why am I a ghost? You can't just leave me like this." He halted and raised an imperious, slightly transparent finger. "Stop, I command you." Death shook his head gloomily and stepped through the next wall. The king hurried after him with as much dignity as he could still muster, and found Death fiddling with the girths of a large white horse standing on the battlements. It was wearing a nosebag. "You can't leave me like this," he repeated in the face of the evidence. Death turned to him. "I can," he said. "You're undead, you see. Ghosts inhabit a world between the living and the dead. It's not my responsibility." He patted the king on the shoulder. "Don't worry," he said. "It won't be forever." "Good." "It may seem like forever." "How long will it really be?" "Until you have fulfilled your destiny, I assume." "And how will I know what my destiny is?" said the king desperately. "Can't help there. I'm sorry." "Well, how can I find out?" "These things generally become apparent, I understand," said Death, and swung himself into the saddle. "And until then I have to haunt this place." King Verence stared around at the draughty battlements. "All alone, I suppose? Won't anyone be able to see me?" "Oh, the psychically inclined, close relatives, and cats, of course." "I hate cats." Death's face became a little stiffer, if that were possible. The blue glow in his eye sockets flickered red for an instant. "I see," he said. The tone suggested that Death was too good for cat haters. "You like great big dogs, I imagine." "As a matter of fact, I do." The king stared gloomily at the dawn. His dogs. He'd really miss his dogs. And it looked like such a good hunting day. He wondered if ghosts hunted. And almost certainly not, he imagined. Or ate or drank either, for that matter. And that was really depressing. He liked a big noisy banquet and had quaffed. Quaffing as is like drinking, but you spill more. Many a pint of good ale. And bad ale, come to that. He'd never been able to tell the difference till the following morning, usually. He kicked despondently at a stone and noticed gloomily that his foot went right through it. No hunting, drinking, carousing, no waysailing, no hawking. It was dawning on him that the pleasures of the flesh were pretty sparse without the flesh. Suddenly, life wasn't worth living. The fact that he wasn't living it didn't cheer him up at all. "Some people like to be ghosts," said Death. Said Verence gloomily. "It's not such a wrench, I assume. They can see how their descendants get on. Sorry, is something the matter?" But Verence had vanished into the wall. "Don't mind me, will you?" said Death peevishly. He looked around him with a gaze that could see through time and space and the souls of men, and noted a landslide in distant Klatch, a hurricane in her wonderland, a plague in Hergen. "Busy, busy," he muttered and spurred his horse into the sky. Verence ran through the walls of his own castle. His feet barely touched the ground. In fact, the unevenness of the floor meant that at times they didn't touch the ground at all. As king, he was used to treating servants as if they were not there, and running through them as a ghost was almost the same. The only difference was that they didn't stand aside. Verence reached the nursery, saw the broken door, the trailed sheets, heard the hoofbeats. He reached the window, saw his own horse go full tilt through the open gateway in the shafts of the coach. A few seconds later, 3 horsemen followed it. The sound of hooves echoed for a moment on the cobbles and died away. The king thumped the sill, his fist going several inches into the stone. Then he pushed his way out into the air, disdaining to notice the drop, and half flew, half ran down across the courtyard into the stables. It took him a mere 20 seconds to learn that, to the great many things a ghost cannot do, should be added the mounting of a horse. He did succeed in getting into the saddle, or at least straddling the air just above it, but when the horse finally bolted, terrified beyond belief by the mysterious things happening behind its ears, Verence was left sitting astride 5 feet of fresh air. He tried to run and got about as far as the gateway before the air around him thickened to the consistency of tar. "You can't," said a sad old voice behind him. "You have to stay where you were killed. That's what haunting means. Take it from me, I know." Granny Weatherwax paused with a second scone halfway to her mouth. "Something comes," she said. "Can you tell by the prickling of your thumbs?" said Margaret earnestly. Margaret had learned a lot about witchcraft from books. "The pricking of my ears," said Granny. She raised her eyebrows at Nanny Ogg. Old Goody Whemper had been an excellent witch in her day, but far too fanciful. Too many flowers and romantic notions and such. The occasional flash of lightning showed the moorland stretching down to the forest, but the rain on the warm summer earth had filled the air with mist wraiths. "Hoofbeats," said Nanny Ogg. "No one would come up here this time of night." Margaret peered around timidly. Here and there on the moor were huge standing stones, their origins lost in time, which was said to lead mobile and private lives of their own. She shivered. "What's to be afraid of?" she managed. "Us," said Granny Weatherwax smugly. The hoofbeats neared, slowed, and then the coach rattled between the furze bushes, its horses hanging in their harnesses. The driver leapt down, ran around to the door, pulled a large bundle from inside, and dashed towards the trio. He was halfway across the damp peat when he stopped and stared at Granny Weatherwax with a look of horror. "It's all right," she whispered, and the whisper cut through the grumbling of the storm as clearly as a bell. She took a few steps forward, and a convenient lightning flash followed her to look directly into the man's eyes. They had a peculiarity of focus that told those who had to know that he was no longer looking at anything in this world. With a final jerking movement, he thrust the bundle into Granny's arms and toppled forward, the feathers of a crossbow bolt sticking out of his back. 3 figures moved into the firelight. Granny looked up into another pair of eyes, which were as chilly as the slopes of hell. Their owner threw his crossbow aside. There was a glimpse of chainmail under his sodden cloak as he drew his sword. He didn't flourish it. The eyes that didn't leave Granny's face weren't the eyes of one who bothers about flourishing things. They were the eyes of one who knows exactly what swords are for. He reached out his hand. "You will give it to me," he said. Granny twitched aside the blanket in her arms and looked down at the small face, wrapped in sleep. She looked up. "No," she said, on general principles. The soldier glanced from her to Margaret and Nanny Ogg, who were still as the standing stones of the moor. "You are witches," he said. Granny nodded. Lightning skewered down from the sky, and the bush 100 yards away blossomed into fire. The 2 soldiers behind the man muttered something, but he smiled and raised a mailed hand. "Does the skin of witches turn aside steel?" he said. "Not that I'm aware," said Granny levelly. "You could give it a try." One of the soldiers stepped forward and touched the man's arm gingerly. "Sir, with respect, sir, it's not a good idea." "Be silent." "But it's terrible bad luck to—" "Must I ask you again?" "Sir," said the man. His eyes caught Granny's for a moment and reflected hopeless terror. The leader grinned at Granny, who hadn't moved a muscle. "Your peasant magic is for fools, Mother of the Night. I can strike you down where you stand." "Then strike, man," said Granny, looking over his shoulder. "If your heart tells you, strike as hard as you dare." The man raised his sword. Lightning speared down again and split a stone a few yards away, filling the air with smoke and the stink of burnt silicon. "Missed," he said smugly, and Granny saw his muscles tense as he prepared to bring the sword down. A look of extreme puzzlement crossed his face. He tilted his head sideways and opened his mouth as if trying to come to terms with a new idea. His sword dropped out of his hand and landed point downwards in the peat. Then he gave a sigh and folded up, very gently, collapsing in a heap at Granny's feet. He gave him a gentle prod with her toe. "Perhaps you weren't aware of what I was aiming at," she whispered. "Mother of the Night, indeed." The soldier who had tried to restrain the man stared in horror at the bloody dagger in his hand and backed away. I couldn't let... It shouldn't have... It's not right to..." he stuttered. "Are you from around these parts, young man?" said Granny. He dropped to his knees. "Mad wolf, ma'am," he said. He stared back at the fallen captain. "You'll kill me now," he wailed. "But you did what you thought was right," said Granny. "I didn't become a soldier for this, not to go around killing people." "Exactly right. If I was you, I'd become a sailor," said Granny thoughtfully. "Yes, a nautical career. I should start as soon as possible. Now, in fact. Run off, man. Run off to the sea where there are no tracks. You will have a long and successful life. I promise." She looked thoughtful for a moment and added, "At least, longer than it's likely to be if you hang around here." He pulled himself upward, gave her a look compounded of gratitude and awe, and ran off into the mist. "Now, perhaps, someone will tell us what this is all about." "Granny," said Granny, turning to the third man. To where the third man had been. There was the distant drumming of hooves on the turf, and then silence. Nanny Og hobbled forward. "I could catch him," she said. "What do you think?" Granny shook her head. She sat down on a rock and looked at the child in her arms. It was a boy, no more than 2 years old, and quite naked under the blanket. She rocked him vaguely and stared at nothing. Nanny Og examined the 2 corpses with the air of one for whom laying out holds no fear. "Perhaps they were bandits?" said Margaret tremulously. Nanny shook her head. "A strange thing," she said. "They both wear the same badge. 2 bears on a black and gold shield. Anyone know what that means?" "It's the badge of King Verence," said Margaret. "Who's he?" said Granny Weatherwax. "He rules this country," said Margaret. "Oh, that king," said Granny, as if the matter was hardly worth noting. "Soldiers fighting one another. Doesn't make sense," said Nanny Og. "Margaret, you have a look in the coach." The youngest witch poked around inside the bodywork and came back with a sack. She upended it and something thudded onto the turf. The storm had rumbled off to the other side of the mountains now, and the watery moon shed a thin gruel of light over the damp moorland. It also gleamed off what was, without any doubt, an extremely important crown. "It's a crown," said Margaret. "It's got all spiky bits on it." "Oh dear," said Granny. The child gurgled in its sleep. Granny Weatherwax didn't hold with looking at the future, but now she could feel the future looking at her. She didn't like its expression at all. King Verence was looking at the past, and had formed pretty much the same view. "You can see me?" he said. "Oh, yes, quite clearly, in fact," said the newcomer. Verence's brows knotted. Being a ghost seemed to require considerably more mental effort than being alive. He'd managed quite well for 40 years without having to think more than once or twice a day, and now he was doing it all the time. "Ah," he said, "you're a ghost too. Well spotted." "It was the head under your arm," said Verence, pleased with himself. "That gave me a clue." Does it bother you? I can put it back on if it bothers you, said the old ghost helpfully. He extended his free hand. Pleased to meet you. I'm Champot, King of Lancre. Verence, likewise. He peered down at the old king's features and added, Don't seem to recall seeing you in the pictures in the long gallery. Oh, all that was after my time, said Champot dismissively. How long have you been here, then? Champot reached down and rubbed his nose. About 1,000 years, he said, his voice tinged with pride. Man and ghost. 1,000 years! I built this place, in fact. Just got it nicely decorated when my nephew cut off my head while I was asleep. I can't tell you how much that upset me. But 1,000 years, Verence repeated weakly. Champot took his arm. It's not that bad, confided as he led the unresisting king across the courtyard. Better than being alive in many ways. It must be bloody strange ways, then, snapped Verence. I liked being alive. Champot grinned reassuringly. You'll soon get used to it, he said. I don't want to get used to it. You've got a strong morphogenic field, said Champot. I can tell. I look for these things. Yes, very strong, I should say. What's that? I was never very good with words, you know, said Champot. I always find it easier to hit people with something, but I gather it all boils down to how alive you were. When you were alive, I mean. Something called, he paused, animal vitality. Yes, that was it, animal vitality. The more you had, the more you stay yourself, as it were, if you're a ghost. I expect you were 100% alive when you were alive, he added. Despite himself, Verence felt flattered. I tried to keep myself busy, he said. They had strolled through the wall into the great hall, which was now empty. The sight of the trestle tables triggered an automatic reaction in the king. How do we go about getting breakfast? He said. Champot's head looked surprised. We don't, he said. We're ghosts. But I'm hungry. You're not, you know. It's just your imagination. There was a clattering from the kitchens. The cooks were already up, and in the absence of any other instructions, they were preparing the castle's normal breakfast menu. Familiar smells were wafting up from the dark archway that led to the kitchens. Verence sniffed. Sausages, he said dreamily. Bacon, eggs, smoked fish. He stared at Champot. Black pudding, he whispered. You haven't actually got a stomach, the old ghost pointed out. It's all in the mind, just force of habit. You just think you're hungry. I think I'm ravenous. Yes, but you can't actually touch anything, you see? Champot explained gently. Nothing at all. Verence lowered himself gently to a bench so that he did not drift through it, and sank his head in his hands. He'd heard that death could be bad. He just hadn't realized how bad. He wanted revenge. He wanted to get out of this suddenly horrible castle, to find his son, but he was even more terrified to find that what he really wanted right now was a plate of kidneys. A damp dawn flooded across the landscape, scaled the battlements of Lancre Castle, stormed the keep, and finally made it through the casement of the solar. Duke Felmet stared out gloomily at the dripping forest. There was such a lot of it, wasn't there? It wasn't. He decided that he had anything against trees as such. It was just that the sight of so many of them was terribly depressing. He kept wanting to count them. Indeed, my love, he said. The Duke put those who met him in mind of some sort of lizard, possibly the type that lives on volcanic islands, moves once a day, has a vestigial third eye, and blinks on a monthly basis. He considered himself to be a civilized man, more suited to the dry air and bright sun of a properly organized climate. On the other hand, he mused, it might be nice to be a tree. Trees didn't have ears. He was pretty sure of this, and they seemed to manage without the blessed state of matrimony. A male oak tree. You'd have to look this up. A male oak tree just shed its pollen on the breeze, and all the business with the acorns, unless it was oak apples, no, it was pretty sure it was acorns, took place somewhere else. Yes, my precious, he said. Yes, trees had got all of it worked out. Duke Felmet glared at the forest roof. Selfish bastards. "Certainly, my dear," he said. "What?" said the Duchess. The Duke hesitated, desperately trying to replay the monologue of the last 5 minutes. There had been something about him being half a man and infirm on purpose, and he was sure that there had been a complaint about the coldness of the castle. Yes, that was probably it. Well, those wretched trees could do a decent day's work for once. "I'll have some cut down and brought in directly, my cherished," he said. Lady Felmet was momentarily speechless. This was by way of being a calendar event. She was a large and impressive woman who gave people confronting her for the first time the impression that they were seeing a galleon under full sail. The effect was heightened by her unfortunate belief that red velvet rather suited her. However, it didn't set off her complexion, it matched it. The Duke often mused on his good luck in marrying her. If it wasn't for the engine of her ambition, he'd be just another local lord with nothing much to do but hunt, drink, and exercise his droit de seigneur. Being whatever that was, he'd never found anyone prepared to explain it to him. But it was definitely something a feudal lord ought to have, and he was pretty sure it needed regular exercise. Imagine it was some kind of large hairy dog. He was definitely going to get one, and damn well exercise it. Instead, he was now just a step away from the throne, and might soon be monarch of all he surveyed. Provided that all he surveyed was trees. He sighed. "Cut what down?" said Lady Felmet icily. "Oh, the trees," said the Duke. "What have the trees got to do with it?" "Well, there's such a lot of them," said the Duke, with feeling. "Don't change the subject." "Sorry, my sweet." "What I said was, how could you have been so stupid as to let them get away? I told you that servant was far too loyal. You can't trust someone like that." "No, my love." "You didn't by any chance consider sending someone after them, I suppose?" "Benson, my dear, and a couple of guards." "Oh," the Duchess paused. Benson, as captain of the Duke's personal bodyguard, was as efficient a killer as a psychotic mongoose. It would have been her choice. It annoyed her to be temporarily deprived of a chance to fault her husband, but she rallied quite well. "He wouldn't have needed to go out at all if only you'd listened to me, but you never do." "Do what, my passion?" The Duke yawned. It had been a long night. There had been a thunderstorm of quite unnecessarily dramatic proportions, and then there had been all the messy business with the knives. It had already been mentioned that Duke Felmet was one step away from the throne. The step in question was the top of the flight leading to the great hall, down which King Varens had tumbled, in the dark, only to land, against all the laws of probability, on his own dagger. It had, however, been declared by his own physician to be a case of natural causes. Benson had gone to see the man and explained that falling down a flight of steps with a dagger in your back was a disease caused by unwise opening of the mouth. In fact, it had been already caught by several members of the king's own bodyguard who had been a little bit hard of hearing. There had been a minor epidemic. The Duke shuddered. There were details about last night that were both hazy and horrible. He tried to reassure himself that all the unpleasantness was over now, that he had a kingdom. It wasn't much of one, apparently being mainly trees, but it was a kingdom, and it had a crown, if only they could find it. Lancre Castle was built on an outcrop of rock by an architect who had heard about Gormenghast but hadn't got the budget. He'd done his best, though, with a tiny confection of cut-price turrets, bargain basements, buttresses, crenellations, gargoyles, towers, courtyards, keeps, and dungeons. In fact, just about everything a castle needs, except maybe reasonable foundations and the kind of mortar that doesn't wash away in a light shower. The castle leaned vertiginously over the racing white waters of Lancre River, which boomed darkly 1,000 feet below. Every now and again a few bits fell in. Small as it was, though, the castle contained 1,000 places to hide a crown. The Duchess swept out to find someone else to berate, and left Lord Felmet looking gloomily at the landscape. It started to rain. It was on this cue that there came a thunderous knocking at the door. It seriously disturbed the castle porter, who was playing Cripple Mr. Onion with the castle cook and the castle's fool in the warmth of the kitchen. He growled and stood up. "There is a knocking without," he said. "Without what?" said the fool. "Without the door, idiot." The fool gave him a worried look. "A knocking without a door," he said suspiciously. "This isn't some kind of zen, is it?" When the porter had grumbled off in the direction of the gatehouse, the cook pushed another farthing into the kitty and looked sharply over his cards at the fool. "What's a zen?" he said. The fool's bell tinkled as he sorted through his cards. Without thinking, he said, "Oh, a subsect of the Turnwise Clash philosophical system of some tin, noted for its simple austerity and the offer of personal tranquility and wholeness achieved through meditation and breathing techniques. An interesting aspect is the asking of apparently nonsensical questions in order to widen the doors of perception." "How's that again?" said the cook suspiciously. He was on edge. When he'd taken the breakfast up to the great hall, he'd kept getting the feeling that something was trying to take the tray out of his hands, and as if that wasn't bad enough, this new duke had sent him back for... he shuddered. Oatmeal! And a runny boiled egg! The cook was too old for this sort of thing. He was set in his ways. He was a cook in the real feudal tradition. If it didn't have an apple in its mouth and you couldn't roast it, he didn't want to serve it. The fool hesitated with a card in his hand, suppressed his panic, and thought quickly. "I faith, nuncle," he squeaked, "thou'rt more full of questions than a Martlebury is of missel-nails." The cook relaxed. "Well, okay," he said, not entirely satisfied. The fool lost the next 3 hands just to be on the safe side. The porter, meanwhile, unfastened the hatch in the wicket gate and peered out. Who dost knock without?" he growled. The soldier, drenched and terrified though he was, hesitated. Without what?" he said. "If you're going to bugger about, you can certainly bloody well stay without all day," said the porter calmly. "No, I must see the Duke upon the instant," shouted the guard. "Witches are abroad." The porter was about to come back with "good time of year for it," or "wish I was too," but stopped when he saw the man's face. It wasn't the face of a man who would enter into the spirit of the thing. It was the look of someone who had seen things a decent man shouldn't wot of. And that will be all for today. I might upload some more tomorrow, I might upload some more the next day. I don't suspect it matters very much, as I don't exactly have the readers to be listening to what I currently have, so I'll just upload whenever I feel the fancy. So, I hope it was a pleasant 45 minutes. I hope that my voice was up to snuff. It kinda hurts now. I don't usually talk this much. I don't like the sound of my own voice, but I'm gonna listen to 45 minutes of it anyways to edit all of this and get it ready to be uploaded to Spotify. So, thank you very much for your time, for your patience, for listening to me prattle on about a book I love very much, and I hope that you have a good night. Cheerio.